Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. We have a very large call today with over 1,200 people registered to join. And I can see we already have about 400 people on. So I'm going to wait another minute, probably 2 to 3 minutes to give more people a chance to join before we get started. We'll get started soon. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is Diane. I'm going to give it another minute or two to allow for more people to join. We have about 500 people on, and we have over 1,200 people registered. So I'm going to give it a few more minutes to allow for more people to get on before we get started. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give it one more minute before we get started. We've got about 600 people on the line, and we're still expecting many more. So I want to give people a chance to join before we get started. I'll give it about one more minute. Thanks for your patience. Okay, hi everybody. This is Diane Yantell. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining today's call on coronavirus disasters, housing, and homelessness. We have a lot of important updates and research and news to share on today's call. And we have a very large call. We have about 650 people on the line already. We have about 1,200 people registered. So thanks to all of you who are joining today. And before we jump right into the agenda, I just want to give a couple of brief updates at the top of the call, all of which we're going to talk about more during the call. So first, I just want to make very clear to everybody who's joined that the federal CDC eviction moratorium remains in effect. And I want to ask for all of you to help us get the word out on that as broadly and as quickly as possible. As you might know, on Thursday night, a federal district court judge in Texas ruled that the CDC eviction moratorium is unconstitutional. Despite his ruling, the federal eviction moratorium does remain in effect. That district court ruling applies only in a very narrow way. It only applies to the plaintiffs in the suit, and it has no impact more broadly than that on other renters or other landlords. The case wasn't brought as a class action, and so it's not binding on any other landlords, tenants, or courts. It can have an impact on its ability to persuade, although the ruling itself is very flawed, and so is probably limited to even in that effect. But there very well may be landlords who attempt to evict and cite this federal eviction, this district court judge's ruling. So it's also important to keep in mind that as of now, 4 federal district court judges have ruled on the constitutionality of the CDC eviction moratorium. 1, the judge in Texas, ruled it unconstitutional. 3 other federal district court judges have upheld the CDC eviction moratorium as constitutional. And the Department of Justice says the same, and they are appealing this ruling in Texas. So we'll talk more at length later on the call about specifics around the ruling and what it means, but I just wanted to say that at the top of the call. And again, really to urge everybody to share that word widely and broadly. There are some alarming headlines that imply that the moratorium may not be in effect. And certainly the attorneys in the case themselves are doing their best to spread the word that the CDC eviction moratorium is not in effect, and that is wrong. So please share the word, spread the word so that renters don't panic and renters continue to take advantage of the protections under the order. Also, just brief updates on emergency rental assistance. A reminder, of course, last week we talked at length about the new FAQ from the Department of Treasury. So you should take a look at that if you haven't already. Later in the call, we'll hear from the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Treasury who is leading on that program, and we'll get a chance to ask him some further questions. But a reminder too that at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we are tracking all emergency rental assistance programs that have been created during the pandemic. At last count, we were up to over 620 programs that we are tracking. And we are starting now to see many state and local programs beginning to open, accept applications, and get money out with the new $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. So at last count, and this is as of this morning, we know of 15 statewide programs that have opened with their emergency rental assistance funds. And those states are Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Hawaii, Idaho, Kentucky, Maine, Missouri, Nebraska, Nevada, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And there are also 22 local programs that are opened. And because the new FAQ is out and is much better than the previous one, I expect we'll see many more programs opening in the coming days and weeks. So you can check our rental assistance database, which Elena just put a link up to in the chat box. The team updates that 3 times a week. So please be sure to check back to see which programs are opening. And also I should mention on the eviction moratorium, everything that I just spoke to, we put into a fact sheet so that you can use it for your own talking points. And I believe Sarah has already put that up in the chat box and can do so again now, so you can find it easily. Okay, and then we'll talk later in the call. Also good news, the House passed the latest COVID relief package, which includes over $40 billion in resources for homelessness and renters and homeowners. And we'll talk more in depth about that later in the call as well. So now I'm going to turn to our first set of speakers. And I'm really glad to welcome to the call Ingrid, Gould, Ellen, and Brittany Mazzurco Muscato, both from NYU Furman Center, who are putting out a paper today that is co-branded with the National Income Housing Coalition and University of Pennsylvania on advancing equity in emergency rental assistance programs. And of course, Furman and UPenn are the groups that we partnered with in previous and in future emergency rental assistance program analysis. So Ingrid and Brittany, thanks so much for joining the call. I'll turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you very much, Diane. I'm very happy to be here to talk about a policy brief that we are releasing today that is co-authored by me and Brittany Mazzurco Muscato from the Furman Center, with Vincent Reyna and Claudia Aiken from the Housing Initiative at Penn, and Andrew Orend and Rebecca Ye from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And this is the second of 3 briefs that our 3 organizations have collaborated on. And this one focuses on racial equity. So get this to, so sorry, I've skipped, sorry, got to get my, there we go. Here we go. Okay. The data that we're drawing on here is first the survey that we conducted together with Penn and the coalition with over 200 programs around the country, which we summarized on our first report, and I've put the link here, together with document review and interviews with selected program administrators. And drawing on these sources, we highlight 5 lessons for states and localities to design and implement more equitable rental assistance programs. And I'm going to briefly present the findings here. We're literally releasing this any minute, so I hope the link will be put in the chat, but if not, we will send it. We'll get a way to send it to you afterwards. The first lesson here, sorry, is relates to funding. As I think probably all of you know, Congress and Treasury basically allocated funding to states and localities based on total population share rather than renter population share or the share of estimated need. And thus, although localities with more than 200,000 residents in this next round, in this current round, were able to receive emergency rental assistance funding directly, these amounts typically fell far short of their share of the actual need. And so, just to give you an example from my home in New York City received 19% of the total of New York State's rental assistance, but we estimate that 75% of the state's rental need is concentrated in New York City, of COVID-related rental need, I should say. And 74 and about 80% of the state's Black and Latinx renter households are located in New York City, respectively. And so I think it's pretty critical that states make funding flows more equal by, either passing on additional state assistance to large cities or by ensuring that people in large cities, renters in large cities, are able to apply and have fair access to the state's rental assistance program. The second lesson relates to targeting. And the new Treasury guidance makes clear that states and localities can introduce additional priority criteria to target households with greater needs. And we found in our survey that about half of the early round programs that the first round programs that we surveyed created priority groups such as very low income households or families with children. And localities might also consider prioritizing applications that originate from disadvantaged census tracts or target small landlords who are most likely to have, less likely to have resources to manage lost rental revenues and are more likely to be households of color. And finally, the process used to select recipients matters for equity too. Some existing city programs we found sort of tried to move away from first come, first serve processes as they felt that they sort of recognized that they might be disadvantaging renters with limited technology access and language barriers. And so, program coordinators could potentially reduce those disadvantages by awarding assistance through random lottery among applicants that come in within a set application window. So one example that we want to highlight is from Harris County, Texas, which used a lottery to choose recipients and then prioritize those who are ineligible for unemployment assistance first, and also those coming from census tract that scored high on the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, which includes racial composition as one of, I think, six factors. So that's another. That's one example. The third lesson relates to outreach and targeting. So, even if, let me say, many localities adopted creative strategies to overcome barriers to sort of who was finding out and learning about programs that or those wary of government assistance due to mistrust, And we found that many existing programs relied on trusted community partners, often smaller nonprofit and community-based organizations to help with outreach. They explicitly chose to work with organizations that had ties to communities with large populations of at-risk renters who might have difficulty learning about or applying to emergency rental assistance programs otherwise. And a good example here is Chicago, which reported sort of initially struggling with getting immigrant populations to apply via their sort of centralized online application. And so in response, the city decided to partner with community organizations to reach underserved communities and believes that really helped them reach a much broader set of renters in need. Another lesson, the fourth lesson, relates to simplification. And this is really critical. Many programs struggled with applicants starting but not completing applications. So even if people were able to find out about programs, they had difficulty finishing completing them. And we found that, in fact, incomplete applications were the most commonly cited challenge by the programs we surveyed. And we found that programs with more documentation requirements, such as requiring, driver's license, proof of income loss, et cetera, were more likely to say that incomplete applications were a problem for their program. And so, and while, our survey couldn't discern exactly who wasn't completing applications, it seems reasonable to assume that applicants facing language barriers, who have irregular income streams, or who work in the informal economy, will have more difficulty proving, for instance, COVID-related income losses. And notably, we found that 90% of programs required a current lease as part of their documentation, which automatically will disqualify those with more informal rental agreements. And so what can localities do? Well, localities can work to ensure that the application process itself is inclusive, that the language in the application is simple, is clear, it's accessible, minimize documentation requirements, and allow for self-certification, which the new Treasury FAQs make very clear is allowable. And working with nonprofits, not only sort of to do outreach, but also to help potential applicants actually fill out applications. And several cities we spoke to did that and found that it boosted completion rates. And so just one example is the city of San Leandro and Oakland produced, the nonprofit that they worked with, produced applications in both English and Spanish. They allowed rental assistance applications, applicants to the option to complete their application online, by phone, by email. And applicants had the option to self-certify in lieu of providing some of the more onerous documentation requirements. So and finally, the fifth lesson relates to data and monitoring. Localities can collect process and outcome data broken down by gender, race, ethnicity, neighborhood, et cetera. Some of this is now required by in this new round of funding. But I think it's critical for programs to monitor not just sort of the ultimate receipt, but intake, participation, even compliance. And the key is to be ready to make mid-course corrections in response to whatever gaps you might uncover. And so, one example is Utah analyzed how approved applications were distributed throughout the state and found that they really were not reaching, to the extent that they wanted to, census tracts with high rates of eviction. And so they're now working on new strategies for more targeted outreach to ensure that more applications are not only submitted, but also approved from high eviction zip codes. And so finally, just in conclusion, it's important to note, and I know I don't have to tell people on this call this, but that many households, especially low-income renters and renters of color, faced housing affordability challenges prior to the pandemic, which COVID-related emergency assistance will not fully address. But we hope that the lessons provided here should help states and localities design and implement more racially equitable strategies to meet those, to not only in their emergency rental assistance programs, but more fundamentally in programs to meet those existing existing needs as well. So thank you. I'm going to stop there. And we can take some questions. And Brittany is here to help me answer questions.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Ingrid. That's really helpful and very useful information. I know we appreciated the partnership with you all in putting this together and with you, Penn, and really appreciate you presenting it. Many people noting in the chat in the Q&A box, thanking you for your work and noting how helpful this is. There's a couple questions. One that comes from Erin Kemple, who says that they are concerned that prioritizing or targeting people living in highly impacted census tracts could disadvantage people of color who have moved to areas with few people of color, and that this might result in BIPOC people who move to areas that are majority white not getting the assistance that they need. So what are your thoughts on that, Ingrid and Brittany?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, look, neighborhood targeting is going to be a proxy at best. I think that, and I will say that you certainly don't want to target 100% of your assistance to highly impacted census tracts. I mean, I think that Brittany, you'll probably remember. I mean, I think that in Harris County, I think that they prioritized, right, that the applications from prioritized census tract received 50% increased chance, but in some other places they have taken some set of their funds to prioritize for those neighborhoods. But they're also, you can also prioritize by individual characteristics as well. Now, I am not a lawyer, but I think that, directly prioritizing by individual race might run into some legal challenges, but certainly prioritizing by, again, those ineligible for unemployment assistance, and there are other proxies for people who are likely to fall through the gaps of existing programs. Brittany, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, what is explained more in the brief in more detail is that what we're finding is a lot of cities are also prioritizing outreach to census tracts. And one of the benefits to that approach is that, in addition to reaching these general areas, connecting with community organizations that have specific ties to these communities, they could also further better reach individual families as well within these broader communities that are in most need of this assistance as well.
Great, thank you both. Another question is, how should or can programs evaluate themselves to determine if they are achieving racial equity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure whoever asked that. I'd be happy to talk to you right offline and further, and anybody else. That's something, certainly as researchers, we're very interested in this. But I think, I think that I think that some cities have done some interesting work in, I mean, first of all, the first piece is you've got to collect the information, right? I know San Antonio did, a really impressive job of mapping out where applications were coming from to try to identify any clear gaps in neighborhoods, and also that in who was actually completing applications and who was receiving assistance. I think kind of breaking down, collecting as much information as you can. And I say all this knowing that, like, I'm a researcher and you all have limited resources and data collection, but you want to look at different stages to also understand kind of where the gaps are emerging. I mean, is it that people aren't in particular areas aren't hearing about the program? Are they not applying? Are they starting applications but not completing them? Are they sort of falling short on, sort of final steps or landlord take up? I mean, so I think that looking at all those steps, and we can, we've done some work at the Furman Center, kind of estimating roughly need in different communities. So you could sort of benchmark against what some estimates of what rental assistance need is likely to be by different demographic groups to see where if your allocation of assistance seems to be matching that.
Good, thanks. And we have a number of people putting really useful and helpful comments and thoughts about what's happening in their communities in the chat box. I just want to encourage people to put that in the Q&A box, or if you put it in the chat box, to make sure that it's directed to all attendees and not just all panelists, so that everybody can see the information you're sharing. For example, in Oakland, Marianne shares that they're using a prioritization tool that includes zip codes impacted by COVID-19 infection, among other priority areas such as 30% of AMI and previously homeless. And it's a point system, and it seems to be working well. And Josephine comments that in majority minority communities, prioritizing funding for those with lower incomes are more likely to reach people of color. Absolutely agree. There's a question from Catherine who says, in her county, which is rural with a large immigrant population, they've decided to rely on credit unions to conduct outreach and collect applications for the rental assistance program. And then the PHA will assess for eligibility. And Catherine is asking if Ingrid and Brittany, if you have any concerns with that approach, with relying on credit unions to conduct outreach and the PHA to assess for eligibility.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that it depends a lot. I think one of the lessons that we found in speaking to these programs, and also came out through our survey, that a lot of it is that on the outreach side, you really want to be partnering with institutions that are trusted in the community. And so I don't know enough about the context to know what the, what sort of how people feel about the credit union. I mean, I think that many cities and programs and states talked about partnering with nonprofits that were embedded in communities and were just better able to reach populations that were wary of receiving government assistance and mistrustful.
Okay, thanks, Ingrid. And I'm going to ask you one more question now, and there's others coming in that perhaps you can respond to via the chat or the Q&A box. But one last question for now, oops, which I just lost. In your research, have you found a correlation between landlord requirements and concessions and take-up rates for the program?
So we did find we did find that if and this is really, let me say, this is from our first report, not from this report.
Right.
That again, partnered with co-authored with the Housing Initiative at Penn and the Coalition, and we found that the programs with the most onerous landlord requirements, sort of some sort of intermediate levels of landlord requirements didn't seem to affect take-up, but the programs that had the most onerous requirements for landlords did seem to see report a small decrease in take-up. But that's you can see that discussion in the first report. So.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. So I'm going to stop there, and again, just note that there are some other questions and comments that Ingrid and Brittany, if you get a chance to respond to now via chat and Q&A, that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll find a way to get those questions answered as follow-up.
Absolutely, thank you for all your questions, and Diane, thank you for the partnership.
Great, thank you, thank you. And as soon as the paper is published and we have a link, we'll share that as well. So thank you both so much for joining and for your work. So I'm going to turn now, I'm going to switch up the agenda a little bit because Noel Poyo from the Department of Treasury has joined. And so I want to stick with the topic of emergency rental assistance. And I want to welcome to the call Noel. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Office of Domestic Finance at the Department of Treasury. And he and his team are leading the Department of Treasury's efforts on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So I also want to say publicly thank you to Noel for being so responsive to the requests that NLIHC and all our partners around the country made in wanting to see improvements to the FAQ document on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Certainly the FAQ that you all published last week was a big improvement from the previous one, and we appreciate your quick and focused work on that. So Noel, thanks so much for joining the call today. I'll turn it over to you, and then hopefully we'll have a chance to do some Q&A because we've got a lot of questions coming in already. Thank you, Noel. Noel, I think you are muted, and looks like maybe you joined by phone. You'll have to unmute yourself. Or Tori, maybe you can assist with that.
There we go. Did it require a *6?
There we go. Now I can hear you. Thank you.
All right. Good. So, can't use my mute button. I'm learning. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. You mentioned all of the feedback. You know how this is supposed to work, right? Is that when people reach out and inform the government of things, we need to respond to them. And so I really want to recognize and appreciate the role that so many of you on this call have played in raising up what are, not easy issues here, right? So my goal here today, and again, I just really appreciate the opportunity to do it, is to give everybody a little bit of framing about how we arrived at the FAQs that were released last week and where we're headed on some of this. And I want to make sure to highlight a few of the significant policy decisions in the FAQs. At this point, everybody's gotten a chance to read them, so I'm not going to be breaking any news. But I'll try and do this all pretty quickly so we can spend more time on questions, which is, I think, probably what will be more useful to everybody. But let me just begin with a little bit of framing. As everybody knows, the day before inauguration, the last administration released some FAQs on January 19th, which left this administration in the position of each day that we were considering any given issue was a day when the guidance on the street was guidance that did not reflect our policy position. And so there was an urgency to get something published, and getting significant policy decisions through a process in the Treasury Department, takes some effort, takes some time, I think for good reasons, but all the same. And so I think most people read these FAQs and say, boy, you sure didn't give a lot of detail there, or why didn't you address this? And you'd be right. The fact of the matter is there are a number of things that we need to go into more deeply. There are issues that we did not address in these FAQs that we need to get to. And so we will be doing that. We will be moving towards full guidance. Even in advance of full guidance, it's clear that there are a number of priority issues that we may need to address even by just adding some additional questions to the FAQ documents. And so just acknowledging that and thanking everybody for their engagement and patience in this process. I also want to make sure that it's clear just how sort of hand in glove Treasury has been working with HUD on this. So it's been part of the reason why we've been able to move at least for us relatively rapidly on this, is that we've had a ton of support and engagement from the HUD team, in particular Peggy Bailey, as you all know, has been a tremendous leader on these issues. As we move forward, I've said we're sort of all ears and look forward to lots of feedback. In these FAQs, we've tried to create a framework for grantees. And so a lot of questions that we've been getting is, well, could you be more specific about that point? And one of the things that we, sort of at the highest level have been concerned about and trying to be sure that we struck the right balance is that the housing market has changed a lot. Conditions on the ground in the middle of a pandemic are different in different places, and depending on what the severity of the pandemic was at any given time, you're seeing changes. And so I think we have to be really careful about prescribing too narrowly, even with good intention, right? Even when we're trying to do the right thing, what a local grantee can do and how they can respond to their local market. And so when we answer lots of questions with, well, that's a policy choice that the grantee can make. They need to document it in their procedures and operate consistent with their procedures. It's not just a kind of government mumbo jumbo, right? I mean, we really do think that every time that we try to lean in and do something good, there's a potential backhand somewhere else. And so you'll see some of that caution, which is really aimed at trying to make sure that the most places in this country can create the best program for their local market. And also you'll see, lots of language about trying to balance access for vulnerable populations and ensuring program integrity and preventing fraud. Our concern about fraud is very real and data-based. Emergency programs tend to be get the attention of fraudsters even more than typical government programs, and so we've got a lot of sort of background on that. And the one thing that could perhaps most broadly threaten these dollars, which are intended for vulnerable populations, is the program being run badly. And so the other thing that we're trying to do for grantees is to create a reasonable and defensible set of guardrails so that we can all stand up in front of congressional hearings and in front of the American people and say, we leaned in for vulnerable people and we protected the public's trust in order to ensure that that money could get to vulnerable people. So just, that gives you a sense of the thinking. Again, everybody sort of read the documents, but I think, the reduction of the timing on landlord engagement from 21 days down to 14 or 10 days, depending on your method of outreach, is a significant change. The biggest issues were around documentation. So one, ensuring that we were really clearly communicated about the expectation that grantees would have flexibility as the form of documentation, and then allowing, creating this framework in which self-attestation was possible. We think it's terribly important that that be available to grantees, and that also it not be viewed as just sort of the first go-to, right? We need to collect information to ensure program integrity, but where particularly in communities where vulnerable populations don't have leases, maybe don't have great relationships with the landlord. All of these things that we know are true out there, that there is a tool available to the grantee to use in the most appropriate circumstance, consistent with their policies and procedures. You'll also see that we provided additional clarity around other housing related expenses, housing stability services. Again, I think areas where there are a lot of questions, particularly internet service or things like legal services. In all of these areas, we are likely to provide a bit more clarity as we move forward in full guidance. But let me stop there. Those are some of the significant policy choices that we made. I think you can make those judgments for yourselves as you read it. But at this point, I'm not able to see the chat as I'm on here, so I will beg that folks read the questions that you want me to respond to. But I'd be pleased to engage in just some discussion and questions.
Great, thanks so much, Noel. And this is Diane again. I'm going to be sorting through the questions and asking them of you. And again, really appreciate your willingness to join the call and answer these questions and to provide that overview of all of the very helpful and important changes that you and your team and others at HUD within the administration made to the FAQ. So one question that we've been getting a lot is, and I certainly understand, and I'm sure you'll share that in some cases you'll be able to answer these and provide further clarity because it's in the FAQ, and in other cases it may be something that there will be more clarity provided in future guidance. But there's a big question about how the funding for administrative fees and services is split. And so it'd be helpful if you could provide some more clarity on how Treasury is interpreting those provisions. The text of the statute is a little confusing in this area, but we and our partners on the Hill read it as providing two separate pots of funds. So 10% of the total 25 billion can be used for administrative fees, and then of the remaining funds, 10% can be used for supportive services. The Trump administration interpreted that differently. I wanted to see if you could share how you and the Biden administration are interpreting that piece.
Sure. So there's a, I guess, sort of a practical consideration here, and then there is the specific question. So we obviously did not address that in the FAQs, and will address it in a further release. I'll say that to the extent that a second round of emergency rental assistance passes, under the sort of the language that we're looking at now, this may, I'm not going to say be a moot point, but be resolved significantly, because there will be more dollars available to address each of these pots that you described. You know, I will say that it does require some significant interpretation as you read the statute to take away the two-pot conclusion. So I think that is, it's not the plain reading of the language, but I think that that's what we're looking at and seeing if there is a reasonable interpretation there. But so you'll see further guidance on that, absolutely. And I hope that the practical pain around this distinction is alleviated if we have another round approved. But appreciate that it is a top concern, and that it's probably a difficult issue to get to the interpretation. But that's why we all have lawyers and push them to read as closely as possible.
Okay, thanks, Noel. Another question that's come up a lot in advance of this call and a few times now on this call is related to undocumented tenants. Certainly, there's nothing in the statute that would prohibit states or localities from using emergency rental assistance funds to serve undocumented immigrants. But there are some state and local governments who are worried about doing so, and what Treasury's opinion of that will be. So can you provide any clarity on what the Department of Treasury's stance on that is, and when and if you will put that into guidance?
So yes, we've gotten this question a lot. I agree with you. The statute does not speak to this matter. And so I think many folks on the call are familiar with the complicated legal space that would cover this question. And we are unlikely to preempt the decisions of local grantees on this. I think in cases where there are grantees that absolutely feel like the legal position and right thing is to exclude undocumented immigrants, I'm not sure that the Treasury Department is going to change their mind. In cases where there are grantees that absolutely feel like they have a legal basis for doing this and the statute doesn't address it, I also think we're unlikely to change their mind. And so I think this is likely to be an issue where, pushing federal lawyers to land on a decision in this space, potentially getting ahead of current litigation that is before numerous courts in the country, might be a tall order. And so I think ultimately these are decisions that are practically going to be made at the local level. So I wouldn't expect in the sort of near, in the next, if we're adding some additional questions to the FAQs, this is probably not going to make it there. And for advocates, I think the discussion is most likely going to be most productive at the local level.
Okay, that's helpful, Noel. Thank you. So you mentioned in your opening that funding for legal services is allowed. That's certainly something that we urged and would be very glad to see. But the language in the FAQ is a little unclear because the text says that an allowable expense would be for attorney's fees for legal proceedings, but legal aid attorneys don't charge attorney's fees. So can you clarify?
Yeah, it's a reasonable point. Sometimes you don't write it as well as you should have.
Okay.
I think you're going to see some clarification on that. I don't think there was an intentional effort to parse the precise definition of what legal services does in that case. We were, I think, trying to connect to the issue of eviction prevention or addressing an eviction situation. And so I would fully expect some additional clarification on that point. I wouldn't overread into the detail there.
Okay.
It's signaling, right? It's signaling.
Okay, that's helpful. So it sounds like the intent is that legal aid attorneys, that the funds can be used to cover legal aid.
We'll provide further clarification.
Got it. Okay, are households that are currently homeless, including those who live in doubled up settings, able to be served with emergency rental assistance?
Boy, you like picking the hard ones. We did not address these sort of challenging, the New York Times came out with an article about sort of, well, what about people who are kind of subleasing or subleasing?
Yeah.
And, it's a challenge, right? And I also think it is, we're going to see that structured in different ways based on market conditions. So some of these things will be very New York, and some of them might be very San Francisco, and some of them might be very sort of Kansas City or Omaha in terms of their kind of what they're seeing. And so I think in general, these kinds of things are going to be, we expect them to be addressed by grantees in their own policies and procedures. This one is maybe particularly challenging because there may be some language in the statute that is implicated. And so we are looking at that carefully. So we'll address that. We'll address that further. With homeless individuals, though, I mean, something that is really clear is the statute does allow for prospective rent payment as long as someone has a rental obligation. And so if one is homeless, but one has a commitment to be able to live somewhere, they have a lease or a rental obligation, that is absolutely anticipated under the law. And one does not have to have arrears, right? Now, if you do have arrears, you have to pay down that arrears. There has to be payment against that arrears if you're going to give prospective payments. But this I think there has been some lack of clarity for, I think, not great reason about whether prospective payments to help people get out of homelessness would be prohibited. Absolutely, it's not, because it's, the clear language of the law allows for prospective payments, regardless of arrears, with that one little caveat that if there are arrears from a previous situation, that some payment needs to be made towards it.
Okay, that's very helpful, Noel. Thank you. And I know we're probably running out of time, but I'm just going to try to squeeze just a couple more questions in, and then hope for continued follow-up conversation. But
great.
A few other questions around who specifically is eligible or can be helped with these funds. So, and I think you and I talked about this previously, but several people are asking if mobile home owners who rent the lot on which their unit sits would be eligible for ERA to cover those costs.
Yeah, and this is an example of a place where I'm really grateful for the engagement from the field, because I think, honestly, I'm kicking myself that we didn't get to this one in the first set of FAQs. There is a bit of a complicated question here that we're working through. And so we do need to address it. I view it as one of our highest priority issues that we have to address. There is a lot of people who will be impacted by this. And so, this is going to go down the list of things where I think we should have been done better faster, but we're going to get there. And if we are able to move a set of additional questions even before full guidance, I would expect that to be on the list. I think it implicates a lot of people, and it's a very important question.
Okay, yeah, very good. And another that I would put in the same category that you may have also heard about is whether somebody who is staying at a hotel who owes rent essentially to that hotel could also be helped with the emergency rental assistance dollars. There's also a lot of very vulnerable, some of the more marginalized people who are in that situation who need the assistance to pay their back rent, such as it is.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple of things here. One is that, to my knowledge, quite a few people that are in this situation are getting some kind of other federal support, FEMA or something like that. And so one issue is just to be very careful about not duplicating assistance, obviously. A dollar paid for out of one source or one subsidy should not be duplicated with ERA dollars. That being said, it sounds like we do need to clarify this, although honestly, I don't think localities are going out on a huge limb by recognizing that as a rental obligation. I mean, I know like a contract to be in a room in a hotel is not the same thing as a lease legally, but yeah, boy, this is one of those areas where like I'm not sure you're going too far out on a limb. That being said, it does appear that we need to address this, and so you can expect that we will.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're not talking about people who were experiencing homelessness who are now in hotels through non-congregate sheltering efforts. We're talking about families or individuals who are in long stay hotels, but like that's rather than renting an apartment, they stay in the hotel because it turns out to be somewhat because that's the housing that they have available to them, and now owe money that they have not been able to pay since they've stayed there during the pandemic. So happy to share.
Yeah, and I'll just say, speaking to you from San Antonio, Texas, there's a bunch of Texans that are going to be on that list simply because of the weather we've had. There's all these different kinds of situations that drive people into temporary settings that it seems to me that, under the basic idea, rent is rent is rent, but let me not get ahead of our legal statements on this. You'll see us address it.
Okay. Well, there's so many more questions that I could be asking, but I know that you've been very generous with your time and I appreciate it. And I will say that we, at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and with this broad network that we work with and through the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, we'll be putting together our suggestions for places where additional guidance is needed and our suggestions for how that should be resolved. And we'll hope to send that to you in the next few days after we get a little bit more input from the field. Would love to continue the conversation with you, and would just ask one final question before you go, which is what you think the timing will be for Treasury to issue, whether it's another FAQ or more comprehensive guidance on the program.
Yeah, I'll address that, but I'll just say that the value of the chat, which I actually have been able to see some of, like if you've saved these chats, boy, I sure would love to get it.
Sure.
But I would expect that about the time that it took us to get these FAQs out is probably, let's just say it would be aggressive to get faster than that on another round. Mm-hmm. But we're not yet in a place where we're sort of committing to a timeline publicly. And in part that is because we're just, we're still getting all this stood up, right? And so, throwing resources at these things, we're moving as fast as we humanly can. That's an exaggerated statement, but I'll say we're getting close to not exaggerating that statement. Yeah. And so I want to take some care in setting expectations, other than to say that you saw how long it took us to put out one set of FAQs. We're running hard and we're getting more people on board. So those are the factors. but I'm not going to put days and weeks on it.
Okay, very good. That's fair and understood. And we will certainly stay in touch. We'll share with you all of the really, really rich feedback that's come during this call and much more that we get in sort of working group calls. And we'll share that all with you soon in the hopes that you'll be able to respond to much of it in a future iteration. So Noel, again, thank you so much for all of your work on this to date, and thanks for the work to come, and for your generosity in joining the call and sharing all this helpful information. I appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to everybody on the call.
Thanks, take care. All right, now I'm going to move to Barbara DiPietro, who is on the line today to talk about increasing access to vaccines for people experiencing homelessness. Barbara, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. I will just plunge in because I just have a few minutes to talk. So I'll go to the next slide on our advocacy ask for people experiencing homelessness. Right now, I'm putting into the chat our organizational sign-on for a letter that we have that's directed at state governors and state and local health authorities about their need to prioritize people experiencing homelessness for this vaccine. In our letter, we have 4 recommendations. Obviously, 1, making this population an eligible population. It is a high-risk population given the congregate settings, and even though so many people are in non-congregate settings now, we know the reality of how people are living and receiving services is in congregate places. We also know that they've got a lot of chronic conditions, particularly diabetes and other issues that make people higher risk. So that's one piece. We do see some states that are doing this really well, but a lot of states are rigidly focused on age as the sole criteria for for determining eligibility. And as many of you know, a lot of our folks just don't live long enough to reach eligible age. And so we're just trying to get folks to do states to have more public health influenced decision making with regard to their at-risk populations. I also would note that there are more people experiencing homelessness every year than there are people living in nursing homes. And yet nursing homes have gotten a lot of the attention. Obviously, they've gotten a big impact from COVID. Our population is much less able, we don't have as much data on our population, but we are just as vulnerable. So we're just trying to get as many organizational sign-ons as we can and asking for 2 actions from you. If you can be advocating with your state and local systems for priority status and getting more thoughtful push for reaching hard to reach populations. Our second recommendation here is to be getting more data on race and ethnicity and getting more data on housing status. We've seen a number of states that just aren't even reporting race and ethnicity data, and at the same time talking about health equity. Well, you can't really determine whether you're meeting health equity unless you're not only collecting data, but using it, rigorously evaluating it, and then doing course correction when you've identified disparities. We're seeing New Jersey has got housing status in its vaccine sign-up system. Minnesota has added housing status to its case tracing system. So they're able to do really good tracking. All states are in a position to be able to do this. Third, as homeless healthcare providers, we are asking for more flexibility that allow us to tailor our approaches to this population, doing more vaccines in shelters, encampments, and other non-clinical spaces, and having our public policies support us doing that. Right now, many of our providers are stymied. We're being sent vaccines and being told to vaccinate our patients, but we're not able to vaccinate anyone anyone under 65, for example, which is very hard for us to be able to do an efficient vaccine reach. Finally, just want to say, I know that Johnson & Johnson single shot vaccine was authorized this weekend, but that vaccine may not be in at front doors for another month. Even though they're rolling now, that could take a while to roll out. We just don't want people to be waiting to deliver vaccines for this population, waiting for another one to come through. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, even one shot of those has been shown to be pretty effective in the preliminary data. So again, we just wanted to do two actions. If you could be calling attention to the need to vaccinate this population as a priority group, and then to sign on to our letter. And I'll just do my next slide. just to make sure that folks are aware that we have a number of resources to support vaccines. Again, if this is your thing, if you're particularly if you're looking at shelters or other large settings where we can be doing bigger events, we really want to do the partnerships that work well here in reaching this population. At this point, I will finish because I know that there's other subjects that you're getting onto. I will put a few of these links again in the chat, but really would appreciate your sign-ons to our letter if that's something that you can do. With that, I'll just do my final slide and say thanks so much for including me in the lineup today. Happy to take any questions though.
Thank you, Barbara. I really appreciate you joining, and sorry to have you be somewhat rushed today. We wanted to make sure to get you on the line so that we could get as many signatures as possible on the letter, but have such a crowded agenda with so many important topics, including this one. So just to say, would be very happy to have you join a future call and have more time to share the local needs and what you're doing to meet them and what you advise. But I will ask you a couple questions before you go that have come in, and also to say that certainly we are signing the letter. We will share it out with our broad network and encourage everybody who is on the line to also sign this letter. It's very important. And a question that came in from Massachusetts is asking about coordination and noting that in Massachusetts, they have prioritization for people experiencing homelessness, but there's not enough coordination by the state, especially for people in family shelters. So any ideas or guidance you have on that, Barbara?
Yes, absolutely. And so states are giving this guidance, but I think it's really your local partners that are helpful here. So your local Department of Health, your local healthcare providers like your Healthcare for the Homeless, if you have one, or other health centers, thinking through your your COCs, how can you be standing up these events, and maybe using university partners or others in your healthcare system that might have extra capacity to give you more hands on deck.
That's great. And another, well, a few questions, and just to give you a chance to maybe expand a little bit on states that are doing well in terms of getting vaccines to unhoused people.
Places that are doing well, Minnesota, DC, Chicago, we're hearing really great things, but again, they've got the flexibility to be able to do most adults and not being limited in terms of venue of where they're able to go. In some states, people are limited from taking vaccines off of a clinical site. So even so our clinics get the vaccine, we want to take it to a shelter, are not able to do that. But places like DC and Chicago have made it a lot more flexible. I will say, I see a comment here in the chat about Maryland. Maryland's a great example of how the state plan allows people experiencing homelessness, because they mentioned congregate settings, but then you had local jurisdictions further clarify and provide the detail around homelessness that allows that to really be a targeted population. So you're seeing some interesting policy decisions there that can be either statewide or can be very local. So if you're having trouble at your state level, really do some advocacy with your mayor or your city or local county council. They really can be allies for here as well.
Great. And actually, I'm going to ask you one more question before you go. Which is about, Sarah is noting that in Montgomery County, that it seems that staff at homeless shelters are prioritized over people who are experiencing homelessness, and asking if that's common across states and localities that haven't rolled out vaccines to unhoused people.
Yes, and this is one of the things that we are advocating for in our letter. So the CDC considers staff at homeless shelters to be essential staff. So they are eligible for the vaccination when essential staff are, and that's usually in tier 1B or 1C. To that end, CDC has acknowledged that if you're going to go in and vaccinate homeless shelter staff, you might as well do shelter residents while you are there, acknowledging their common risks. And so there's an efficiency that you can achieve there by leveraging those pieces together. In our letter, we have links to the CDC guidance that pull all of that information together. And as someone who's calling in from Baltimore City, where our mayor clarified state level guidance in a way that allows us to more flexibly reach more homeless people, I would recommend that in Montgomery County and any other county, you get with your administrative folks and see if you can't get more clarification that allows you more flexibility at the local level.
Great. So helpful, Barbara. Thank you so much for joining and sharing this information, and really would love to have you back soon to continue sharing
Thank
more. Thanks. Okay, now I'm going to go to our next topic, which I covered very briefly at the top of the call around the federal court ruling on the CDC eviction moratorium, the implications of it, and the next steps. And I am going to turn to Eric Dunn from National Housing Law Project to share their analysis. Eric, please go ahead. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, so some pretty bad news toward the end of last week. A U.S. district judge in Texas issued a ruling in a case called Turkle versus CDC that declares the federal CDC eviction halt order unconstitutional. You may have heard that there have been a number of lawsuits filed against the CDC moratorium. Previously, every single one of them to be decided by a court had upheld the order, but this was a different case. The CDC order is based on a federal statute called the Public Health Services Act, which actually authorizes the Department of Health and Human Services to make regulations for responding to public health emergencies. And one of those regulations authorizes the CDC to do anything it finds reasonably necessary to control the spread of a communicable disease if state and local public health officials are not taking adequate steps. And so it was based on that regulation that the CDC promulgated its eviction halt order. And what the prior litigation around the CDC order has focused on was, did Congress actually intend to authorize the CDC to bar evictions through the Public Health Services Act, or did the agency go too far? And what this case in Texas looked at is, look, we don't even think the judge said, I don't even think Congress has the authority to stop evictions at all. So wouldn't have been able to give CDC this power, even assuming it had intended to. So the ruling basically means that not even Congress can stop evictions, even if the reason is to respond to a public health emergency. So it's a pretty extreme ruling. It seems really off base because the court looked at the CDC order itself as if that's what Congress had done, rather than whether the Congress had authority under the Commerce Clause to enact the Public Health Services Act, which clearly affects interstate commerce. Lawrence Tribe, the famous professor from Harvard, called it crazy. And the Department of Justice has already announced that, in fact, they've already filed their notice of appeal. So it's really an outlier case that really comes out of right field. The ruling is technically a declaratory judgment only. There's no injunction. So what that means is that it only technically affects the parties to the case, meaning the specific landlord groups that filed the lawsuit in Texas. It doesn't apply to other people who did not participate in that litigation. But the judge did say that he'd consider entering an injunction in the future. So there could be more to come from this judge. But the case is on appeal, and in the meantime, tenants still have the right to assert the eviction moratorium. And we issued a memo on our website, nhlp.org, which analyzes this in more detail. But I just think it's, practically, there are going to be a lot of tenants who are going to be confused, that may have heard that the moratorium was struck down and be under the impression that they have no right to use it anymore. And it's going to be difficult, I think, for advocates to advise tenants, because there's certainly a risk that some local judge might decide that he or she agrees with this judge in Texas and decline to honor the moratorium in that local court. So I think this ruling is likely to create a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties. I wish I had a silver lining or some reason to say that this was avoidable, but unless and until the appellate court were to strike this down, I think it's going to be a problem for people.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for that. And thank you for the really helpful legal analysis that you and your colleagues at the Law Project did over the weekend and published this morning. It's in the chat box. Everybody should take a look at that. Also take a look at the one-pager, sort of top line talking points that NLIHC put together. That's also in the chat box. A reminder to everybody that as of right now, the CDC federal eviction moratorium remains in effect, and that the impacts of this Texas lawsuit are on the plaintiffs that were in the case itself. And then, as Eric said, there's certainly the risk that landlords or judges will be persuaded by this one court ruling and may cite it in eviction hearings. So, Eric, knowing that none of us can read the future, you know, now that DOJ has said they would appeal, or in fact they have appealed, it seems that it does increase the risk of the Texas judge issuing an injunction, which he essentially said that he would do in his ruling. He said he would if the government didn't honor his ruling. So what if that judge issues an injunction, what would be the impacts and the immediate next steps and the best ways to protect renters?
Well, it's not clear to me what the judge meant by having the government honor the injunction. Of course, honor the decision. The CDC order authorizes some pretty serious criminal penalties against people who violate it. So people could theoretically be prosecuted under the, for violating the CDC order and fined well into, hundreds of thousands of dollars or incarcerated. So if what the judge means is he doesn't want the Department of Justice trying to criminally prosecute anybody under this, then still having taken the position that it's enforceable around the country, and in other cases beyond just these plaintiffs would not seem inconsistent with that. But it's really not clear exactly what this judge has in mind. So if the judge, acting on his own or pursuant to a motion that the plaintiffs in that case might file, enters further relief, either enjoining the CDC from attempting to enforce it other places or declaring it vacated or something of that nature, then at that point, the DOJ may need to seek a stay from the appellate court to basically prevent that Texas court's ruling from taking effect until the appeal is decided. But it's kind of hard to predict exactly what that would look like until we see, what, if anything, the Texas judge does.
Yeah. Okay. There's also a question from.
But go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I just wanted to say that for folks that had followed any of the litigation and some of the Trump administration rules, there were quite a few cases where a lower court would rule that the Trump administration's order was unconstitutional and would enjoin the administration from enforcing it. But then the court would enter a stay so that even though there was a court that declared it unconstitutional, the rule would remain in effect while the litigation was pending. So that's the type of thing the Department of Justice would need to seek.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Eric. And one other question from Jerry asking about whether this judge is an outlier in the larger judicial system and how vulnerable we are to other, as he says, rogue justices issuing harmful judgments on the CDC eviction moratorium.
Well, I think this view of the Commerce Clause is very extreme because if you follow his reasoning to the logical conclusion, the Public Health Services Act is basically the statute that creates the entire infrastructure for the federal government to respond to public health threats, including infectious disease outbreaks. And the way it works is you have Congress basically saying to these agencies, which are staffed by people with expertise in public health and infectious disease and related issues of science, and saying, you guys are the experts. You're the ones that have to respond to these outbreaks when they occur, and we don't know what's going to necessarily be important to respond to the next outbreak. So whatever that is, if in your scientific opinion you think we need to stop evictions or do something else to control a particular type of outbreak, we're giving you the authority to do that. And you can't always predict exactly what that might be, because all diseases are different and they're transmitted in different ways and have different risks and dangers associated with them. So there was really no way that Congress could have anticipated all the different types of things that the CDC might need to do in order to control COVID-19 or any other disease. And so when you say that Congress never made any findings telling CDC that you could do an eviction moratorium, that's not close enough to interstate commerce. What that really has the effect of doing is saying, look, CDC, you can't do things that Congress didn't already think about to stop infectious diseases unless you can show that they're directly related to interstate commerce. And that can really undercut the ability of CDC to respond to public health threats like COVID-19 or something else that might come along in the future. And so I really don't think that this reasoning can be sustainable. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of judges who share this judge's sort of desire to limit congressional authority, limit federal power. But I think if you're taking away the federal government's ability to respond to disease outbreaks and infectious disease hazards, even for the real right-wing judges, I think that's going pretty far.
Okay, thanks so much for Eric for that, and thank you again for all of your expertise and for sharing it on this call. Folks should again check out the memo that the National Housing Law Project put out. We'll put it in the chat box again, and much more to come on this. Eric, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Take care. So just to reiterate, and again to encourage people to look at both documents that are in the chat box, just to reiterate and ask everybody again for your help in getting the word out as widely as possible to as many renters as possible, that the CDC federal eviction moratorium remains in effect despite this moratorium, despite this ruling from the Texas judge. The district court ruling in Texas only applies to the plaintiffs in the case. It has no broader impact on renters. So the CDC federal eviction moratorium is in effect. The Department of Justice said the same this weekend. And also a reminder that there are 4 federal district court judges that have issued decisions relating to the CDC's eviction moratorium, and 3 have rejected claims by landlords that the moratorium is unlawful or unconstitutional. 3 federal district court judges have upheld the constitutionality of the CDC eviction moratorium. So it remains in effect, but there's a rocky road and an uncertain road ahead. There could be more news breaking on this any day, any hour, and when there is, certainly we will let you all know the latest. I encourage everybody, we continue to urge President Biden and the full Biden administration to vigorously defend the moratorium in court and to further extend and strengthen and enforce the order. So I also want to remind everybody that we have a sign-on letter that is open right now for organizations to join us in calling on President Biden to further extend and strengthen and enforce the eviction moratorium. We have over 2,200 organizations signed on already, and the deadline, we're going to close that letter on March 14th or 15th. So please, if you haven't signed that letter, please do, and please circulate it to your networks. Okay, I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, which is our first field update. And that is from Mark Jolin, who is the director of the Joint Office for Homeless Services in I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that county in Oregon. Mark, thank you for joining, and please correct me and tell me how to pronounce that county correctly.
I'm happy to be here. It is the Joint Office of Homeless Services for Multnomah County. It is the city of Portland and Multnomah County in Oregon. First of all, thank you for the invitation and for the tremendous work that this coalition has been doing throughout the course of the pandemic. Today has been incredibly educational to be part of this conversation. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes. I was asked to talk about a recent severe weather event that our community experienced. It happened over the sort of Valentine's Day week, a couple of sub-freezing days, followed by about a foot of snow and ice, temperatures in the 20s with wind chills in the single digits, which for us is very unusual, especially the depth of snow and the cold. And recognizing that other parts of the country, in particular Texas, were experiencing some even more unusual and more severe conditions at the same time. For context, Portland and Multnomah County pre-COVID have about 4,000 people experiencing unsheltered, sheltered and transitional housing homelessness on a given night. About half of those folks are unsheltered. So going into the sort of pre-COVID times, we'd have about 2,000 people outside. With COVID, we've seen some increase in the total number of folks outside, but what we've really seen most dramatically is that folks who are unsheltered have concentrated themselves into larger ongoing unsanctioned encampments, largely a function of the CDC guidance around not moving encampments, but that became very relevant for our planning around severe weather response this year. In our community, our commitment is to not turn anyone away from shelter during a severe weather event, and we rely heavily on our community-based shelter providers for that, as well as our county emergency management infrastructure. Going into this year, recognizing that running large congregate shelters was going to be challenging, our community-based organizations that do shelter have been stretched. They've doubled the number of programs that they're operating in order to honor the physical distancing requirements. We also knew it was going to be challenging to find people to work and volunteer. We rely heavily on shelter staff, but also community volunteers and county and city employees to staff severe weather shelters. We knew that was going to be a challenge this year. So the system that we designed and implemented during the severe weather event began by focusing more on outreach and the distribution of quality severe weather gear, 0-degree sleeping bags, tents. In this instance, we put several thousand of each out into the community in the week running up to the event. We expanded the number of outreach workers who could check on people in encampments. For those of you who do this work, you know that one of the challenges with severe weather incidents and the unsheltered population is that folks may be reluctant to leave their encampments and come to shelter. And with the amount of sort of established unsanctioned camping going on, we figured that was going to be even a bigger challenge this year because people were not going to want to leave their stuff behind. So getting good gear out and having more outreach capacity to check on people was of paramount importance. We did create through our convention center one very large severe weather shelter and worked with our public health department to be able to provide rapid testing to everyone who showed up there at the door. So we were able to screen people in. There's a lot of concern that if we didn't test, we'd have people showing up with cold symptoms who we would need to screen out because we couldn't be sure whether they were COVID positive or not. We also created satellite locations where we deposited severe weather gear close to transit. And people could stay if they were not symptomatic. If they were symptomatic, we could get them to the convention center to be tested. And then finally, we maintained rooms in what are our voluntary isolation hotels for people who are COVID positive, so that if anybody did test positive during the course of the event, they could move there. The one thing that we did for folks who couldn't get into congregate, didn't want to come into congregate, didn't feel safe, was to create a parking garage, which we'd never done before. It ended up hosting about 250 people over the course of the event. We heated it with some industrial propane heaters, and it turned out to work pretty well. Everybody there had their own tent and sleeping bag and pad that they were given when they arrived. They didn't come with their own, and it at least provided a modicum of safety from the event. The takeaways for us, one was that we didn't have anybody test positive. All the hundreds of people that we tested at that convention center shelter, that was a surprise to us, but a positive. for sure. And then we ended up relying a lot on transit with our first responders because our public transportation system shut down. So those were our big takeaways from this event. The system worked reasonably well, and it was dramatic for the folks who were outside.
Certainly was, Mark, and thanks for your good work for limiting the trauma as best as possible. I really appreciate you joining today's call to share this news and the work that you've done in Multnomah County, Oregon. So thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure.
And I'll turn now to our next and last field update, which comes from Kendra Knighton, who is with she is a policy associate with the Idaho Asset Building Network and Idaho Voices for Children. Kendra, please go ahead. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Diane. So last time I joined you all for this call, we had just learned that the federal emergency rental assistance allocated to the state of Idaho would require legislative approval. And Idaho state lawmakers had not traditionally worked on housing policy, especially policies that provide rent relief or assistance. So at that time, we were fairly uncertain about how lawmakers would respond to this type of proposal. And right off the bat, we began to hear some very concerning positions from many of our Republican lawmakers, and approval of the funds was very frankly uncertain. So in response to this, we coordinated a very robust advocacy effort to elevate the need for the legislature to immediately approve the full allocation to make sure that this relief would be made available to Idahoans as quickly as possible. And to do that, we brought in many old and many new partners throughout the state to help demonstrate the widespread support and need for rental assistance that exists throughout Idaho. So first, we mobilized our really incredible and always dependable multi-sector housing coalition that we partner with often to promote affordable housing policies in Idaho. And for this particular effort, we also asked our coalition to tap into their own networks to help us identify some new partners in this work. We received a really incredible response from organizations throughout the state, and we ultimately ended up sending a sign-on letter to every member of the legislature with about 50 organizations signed on to that letter. And for reference, about half of those organizations that joined our letter were new to our efforts. And that was something that we were very grateful for and something that was very impactful as we were trying to demonstrate the statewide need for this assistance. We also tapped into the business perspective by encouraging our major utility companies and the Apartments Association to also reach out to the legislature about the need for this. And then finally, we also garnered a significant amount of community input. So during the few weeks that we were putting together these efforts, we had almost 1,000 individual emails sent to lawmakers over the course of that month. So I am now very happy and extremely relieved to be able to report that 2 weeks ago, the Idaho House of Representatives voted to approve the funding with only 10 representatives voting in opposition. And last week, we were thrilled that the Idaho Senate voted to approve the funding unanimously. So the bill is now headed to the governor for signature, but this bill is executive legislation, so we feel pretty optimistic about his willingness to support it. So with that, I would just like to thank the NLIHC for the opportunity to give this update today, and also for all the incredible support that they have offered as we have tried to navigate this process. So thank you again, Diane, and I will pass it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Kendra. It's really great work that you and your colleagues at Idaho Asset Building Network have done. We were really worried when we first heard about what was going on in Idaho and the possibility of these funds not getting to the Idahoan renters who need the funds. And you all mobilized and did really impressive work to turn that around. So thanks for your advocacy and your organizing. And thanks so much for sharing that with us today. And now I will turn to our last speaker of the call today, which is Sarah Sadie from NLIHC, VP for Public Policy, to talk about latest on the American Rescue Plan and what's next. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Diane. This week is going to be another very, very busy week on the Hill as congressional leaders push their COVID relief bill through the final stages. Last Friday, we saw the House of Representatives vote to approve the American Rescue Act Plan Act. It passed 219 to 211, so a relatively tight vote on that bill. Now it heads to the Senate. We expect Democrats to release what's called a substitute amendment to the House passed version. That's going to be adding some money, we believe, for Amtrak, cybersecurity, and Medicare payments, among some other tweaks to the House passed bill. We are currently checking to see whether or not any of these changes have any impacts on housing or homelessness programs. By Wednesday, we expect Senate Democrats to introduce their draft substitute for the House bill. That'll kickstart 20 hours of debate on the Senate floor, followed by what's called a vote-a-rama, where senators will vote on a series of amendments. We expect that amendment process to start Thursday and could last through Friday, and a final vote on the final package by Friday at the very earliest. I'll go over what we expect in terms of amendments in a second, but first I just want to reiterate what is in the House passed version. This includes a couple of tweaks that were made to the bill through what's called a manager's amendment that passed in the Rules Committee. So the bill includes now $26.1 billion in rental housing assistance. This is an increase of $1.2 billion. That money is added on top of the $19 billion that was provided for emergency rental assistance, and it's targeted to communities that have high needs. We were hoping to see more funds channeled through that better formula, but this is certainly a step in the right direction. The other elements of that $26 billion includes $750 million for tribal housing needs, $100 million for rural housing needs, and $5 billion in emergency housing vouchers that look towards addressing some of the longer term housing stability issues, especially for people experiencing homelessness. The bill also includes $5 billion to help, $5 billion in homelessness assistance. Some of these funds can be used for supportive services or rental assistance, but it can also be used to acquire and convert properties into permanent affordable housing. The intention there is that some of these funds can be used to purchase hotels and motels that people experiencing homelessness have been staying in under the FEMA program that we've talked about before on this call. The bill also includes $9.96 billion in homeowner assistance, $100 million for housing counseling, $20 million for fair housing activities. That's an addition that was not in the original bill, but was added through the Rules Committee, $5 billion in utility and water assistance, and stimulus checks and resources for states, communities, and people in other ways. Now that we see it going to the Senate floor, we do expect changes will be made through the amendment process. So I want to flag for you what we're anticipating and encourage you to reach out to your senators now to encourage them to vote for helpful amendments and against ones that we think will be harmful. So we would love for your help encouraging senators to vote for any amendment that would better target emergency rental assistance resources to people with the lowest incomes who are hardest hit by the pandemic. Any amendment that would increase resources, again, for the lowest income renters or people experiencing homelessness, and any amendment that would help ensure that resources can move more quickly to households in need. We don't think there's a ton of opportunity to see positive amendments because a lot of the bill language has been sorted out among Democrats prior to the bill being brought to the floor, but we do think that there's a serious risk of harm by harmful amendments being proposed and adopted. So this is really where we're going to be focusing much of our attention. So if you could please encourage your senators to vote against any amendment that would reduce funding for low-income renters and people experiencing homelessness, any amendment that would create barriers or make it more difficult to serve households in need, and specifically any amendment that would prevent immigrant households from accessing critical aid. We know this is going to be a major focus of Republican amendments. And so it's important for you to be reaching out to all of your senators to make sure that they vote against any of these harmful proposals. If all goes according to plan and it stays on course, we'll hopefully see a bill pass out of the Senate by the end of the week. At that point, congressional leaders will have to decide how they want to finish this bill up. Because there are going to be changes on the Senate side, they either have to kick the bill back to the House for another vote, or they'll go to conference committee to sort out the details. A lot of that has to do with some technical issues about what sort of changes get made. But their goal is to have something done by March 14th, and it looks like they are on up the path to get that done on time. And I can put in the chat box a link or some more information about the amendments we support and oppose, so that if folks have any questions, they can just refer to that or ask me. Thanks, Diane.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And as Sarah said, we'll be certainly keeping our eye out for any harmful amendments. We'll also be sending out a call to action broadly to our full network tomorrow with the information that Sarah just put into the chat box, so that you can have it in front of you and you can reach out to, and we really urge you to reach out to all of your senators and urge them to oppose harmful amendments, support helpful ones, and pass the legislation. So much more to come on that soon. So just very quickly to recap some next steps, since there's so much happening. One, again, on the eviction moratorium, please spread the word that the moratorium is in effect. Please share the talking points that we've shared with all of you. If there's any breaking news on this in the coming hours or days, certainly we'll let you know as soon as we do. And also, please, if your organization has not already signed the letter to President Biden, urging him to enforce and strengthen and further extend the moratorium, please do. That letter is still open and circulate it to your networks. We have over 2,200 organizations signed on already, and we want as many as possible. On emergency rental assistance, again, a reminder that we're tracking all emergency rental assistance programs. We're updating our database 3 times a week. Check back frequently to see where and how states and localities are opening up their emergency rental assistance programs. And as you heard today, the Department of Treasury will at some point be issuing further FAQs and further guidance. And certainly we want to influence that and share with them all the lessons learned and the changes that we want to see made, or the further guidance we want them to offer. So please join our weekly working group calls, where we'll continue to gather your feedback and your ideas on what we should send to the Department of Treasury. We intend to send them a letter, I'll say by the end of the day, Wednesday, with our updated asks on the emergency rental assistance program. So please share with us your thoughts and insights and guidance on that. Speaking of working group calls, a reminder that today at 6 o'clock is our Tenant Talk Live working group call, where we'll be talking about facial recognition in public housing developments. Every Tuesday at 12:30 is our policy working group call, and at 3 o'clock is our working with FEMA call. And on Wednesday, we have a somewhat rescheduled state and local implementation calls. Those are usually held in later afternoon, mid-afternoon. On Wednesday, it'll be at 12 o'clock noon. So please join all of those calls. They're all an opportunity for us to hear from you about what's working and what's not, and what more needs to be done, and for us to share with you about the latest from Washington, D.C. And a quick update that we have 2 publications coming out this week, both on emergency rental assistance. One you heard from Ingrid and Brittany earlier, our co-authored brief on advancing racial equity through emergency rental assistance. That brief is out today. We'll share it as follow-up for today's call. And on Thursday or Friday this week, we'll be publishing again, NLIHC together with Furman and University of Pennsylvania's Housing Initiative will be publishing another report on what we're hearing from program administrators about what's working, what's not, and best practices for the future. And then I will also say that we're going to have two relevant webinars, relevant to all of you, webinars this month. One on how to utilize non-congregate shelter options for people experiencing homelessness, especially now that President Biden has issued a new policy for 100% reimbursement for those costs. So we'll send you information on that soon. And we will also have a broad webinar on how to ensure that emergency rental assistance programs meet the needs of the lowest income and the most marginalized people. And we'll be hearing from some program administrators real detailed specifics about how they did it so that you can replicate that in your communities. So thanks again, everybody, for joining. Thanks for hanging on for a somewhat longer call than usual. And thanks for all your work. We'll talk again soon. Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.